Glass spiral. Miles Carter steered his dented Ford through 16 unmarked miles of pine wilderness north of Alder Falls, Montana, a ribbon of blacktop half buried under week-old drifts. The February sky lay low and bruise-colored, yet a sickly ribbon of aurora threaded the horizon, pulsing in time with the truck's failing alternator light. Each pulse lit the snowbanks in stuttering frames, as though the night were a film strip skipping and burning. The farther he drove, the more the air inside the cab smelled of overheated electronics and faint ozone, a scent he remembered from the day his weather balloon array back in college caught fire and almost took his brother with it. The road ended at a locked Forest Service gate twisted open by some earlier storm. Beyond it, the slope climbed toward Whisper Peak Research Station. 5 squat modules linked by corrugated corridors and backed against a granite wall. Satellite dishes tilted like wilted flowers. Their surfaces, iced and cracked, reflected the auroral shimmer in shards that roved across the snowfield. When Miles killed the engine, silence dropped so abruptly that his eardrums popped. Then the wind rose, thin and metallic, as though scraping the world's edges. He stepped out. Snow ground beneath his boots with the ordinary crunch of compressed powder, but on the third step a brittle chime rang out, high and tremulous, echoing between the trees. The sound reminded him of tapping a wine glass, only deeper, as if the valley itself were hollow crystal. He crouched, brushed aside loose flakes, and saw a glaze of ice beneath, transparent and flawless. He pressed a glove to it. The surface thrummed faintly, pulsing warmth up his arm in a slow, irregular rhythm like a distant heartbeat. Against the pale glow, the station looked abandoned years longer than the 8 months since budget cuts mothballed it. Solar panels hung crooked, and the main antenna's lattice cast a segmented shadow that seemed to wriggle when he wasn't looking straight at it. A knot tightened in his chest. He told himself it was altitude, that Glacier County's highest ridgeline did strange things to air pressure, but the thought brought no comfort. He had promised Ben that he would never return to this ridge, never tempt the stormlight again. Yet here he was, chasing the grant money offered for salvaging the last data drives. He crossed the open yard, the snow's surface hardened moment to moment, crunch giving way to crisp, tinkling notes. Each footfall left a heel-shaped cavity edged in slivers that caught the aurora like tiny prisms. Behind him, the first few prints already vanished under a thin skin of ice, sealing themselves as if never made. A gust whipped between the balsams, and the treetops answered with a chorus of glassy rattles. It took Miles a heartbeat to realize the needles were sheathed in clear ice all the way to their tips. The entire forest, miles deep, shimmered as one frozen instrument. At the access hatch he paused. The steel door bore a frostburst pattern like a spiderweb of cracks radiating from the center bolt. He fitted the master key, turned it, and felt the mechanism resist as though glued. The latch gave with a soft crack, and heatless vapor curled from the seam, smelling of damp silicon and something sweeter, almost floral, that turned his stomach. Inside, darkness absorbed his headlamp beam for a breath before revealing a narrow tunnel of aluminum plates. Far down the corridor, a red emergency diode blinked at a languid pace, too slow for any working system. He set his duffel by the doorway, feeling the metal floor vibrate faintly through his soles. The pulse matched the rhythm he had felt in the buried ice outside, but stronger, as if the structure had coupled with whatever throbbed beneath the snow. When the beacon blinked, the vibration surged, then eased during the dark interval, like the station was breathing in light. Behind him, the wind died. The sudden stillness pressed against the walls thick as water. Then, from the yard, came that brittle chime again, once, twice, a third time, the notes closer together, climbing in pitch until they merged with the flicker of the red light. Miles's head swam. For an instant, he thought the corridor flexed, edges bowing inward. He forced himself forward, boots skittering on a glaze that should not have been there. Past the first junction, he found the main operations room door ajar, though the manual latch showed locked. On the threshold, a ridge of ice had grown upward like a tiny frozen surf, curving toward him, its translucent crest riddled with air bubbles shaped eerily like fingerprints. At that exact moment, the aurora brightened outside, spilling green fire through a porthole. The light refracted inside the bubbles, casting fingertip-sized motes across the ceiling that writhed as though alive. Every mote pointed toward him for a single heartbeat. An involuntary tremor shook his arms. He registered the rational facts: thermal inversion, latent heat, optical illusion. Yet a crawling certainty bloomed that the ridge, the forest, the station, perhaps the night itself, remembered him. He exhaled, and the mist of his breath drifted not forward but sideways, slipping toward the darkness of the ops room as if drawn by a draft only the vapor could feel. In the silence that followed, Miles finally understood why the regional supervisor had insisted on a solo retrieval. The grant form needed a disposable signature. The realization settled colder than the wind. The red diode blinked again, slower now, and in that lingering span of darkness, the brittle ringing outside resolved into a cadence, deliberate and precise, counting miles he had yet to walk and promises he had already broken. By dawn, a diluted slate light filtered through the portholes, enough to reveal the long corridor as narrower than Miles remembered. Frost feathered across the aluminum walls in branching arabesques that resembled vascular diagrams, each capillary converging toward the sealed bulkhead at his back. He slept barely an hour hunched over the ops console, and now a tremor rode his limbs like residual current. Outside, the aurora had faded, leaving a sky the flat color of old pewter. The silence proved heavier for it, as though the station hovered inside the pause between thunderclaps. He stepped onto the open threshold to fetch the tools he had left by the hatch. The first thing he noticed was that the loose snow around the doorstep had hardened into a glazed sheet during the night, smooth as poured resin. On that glassy surface, directly before the door, lay a perfect spiral of footprints. The depressions were shallow, no deeper than a quarter inch, and pressed with uncanny precision, heel to toe, in a looping continuum without start or terminus. Powdered crystals rimmed every print, twinkling like ground sugar. The spiral measured just wider than a man's arm span, coiling inward 5 tight circuits before ending in a single unblemished point. Miles crouched, tracing the path with his gaze, and felt an unreasonable urge to follow it with his own feet, as if the pattern whispered directions his ears could not hear. To anchor himself, he raised the company-issued camera and snapped a photo, but even before the shutter blinked, he sensed motion. When he lowered the lens, the spiral's inner ring quivered, the prints blurring as though the ground beneath them liquefied. A feathery crack spidered across the ice, and the entire design rearranged, each footprint swapping left for right so quickly that his eyes watered from the impossible edit. The camera's display showed only a smear of overexposed white. He pivoted, heartbeat drumming, and scanned the open yard. No wind stirred the pines. Yet the tree line seemed to have crept inward overnight, trunks looming closer, branches sagging under clotted ice that reflected weak daylight in dulled flashes. From that frozen canopy a single shard snapped free, struck a rock, and rang like a steel rod, the note so pure it hurt his fillings. When the echo faded, the forest went brittle quiet again, as though waiting to see what he would do next. He backed inside, sealing the hatch with a metallic cough. The corridor lights flickered once, then steadied, brighter than during the night inspection. Their fluorescence exposed a wet track leading down the passage, a mirrored replica of the spiral, uncoiled now into a narrow ribbon of watery footprints that glistened on the grated floor. The track started at the doorframe, a precise alignment with the outdoor spiral's final point, and extended deeper than the glow reached. Each print displayed the same impossible switching of left and right footfalls, as if the walker reversed direction between steps. Cold wickened along Miles's spine, not the sharp chill of weather but a slowing internal freeze, dread calcifying muscle by muscle. He reached for the handheld radiation meter clipped to his belt, thumbed it on. The device gave a single anemic chirp, then its digits scrambled, resolving into a rude analog of the pattern ahead. Numeric zeros arranged in tightening helices before the screen dimmed to black. The coincidence felt intentional, tailored, as if the station circuitry had conspired with the thing that walked its halls. He followed the trail despite every instinct, compelled by a nauseating mixture of disbelief and scientific hunger. With each pace, the building's architecture warped fractionally. Doorframes tilted a degree, rivet lines wavered. Overhead, ventilation fans spun idly, though the main power had never been restored. Their blades exhaled a smell like melting insulation mingled with crushed lilac, the same sweet-rot perfume that bled from the hatch hours earlier. At the corridor's midpoint, where two wings met in a cross, the footprints diverged. One route curved toward the dormitory bunks, the other toward the instrument labs, both equally dark, both pulsing with the silent, heartbeat-slow vibration he had first felt in the buried ice outside. In the junction center lay a narrow strip of paper. He stooped and saw it was not paper at all, but a strip of photographic film, edges perforated by sprocket holes. It bore a single frame, a blurry, green-washed image of the yard taken moments earlier from a vantage point 6 feet above his head. The spiral prints shone in that picture like a luminous brand. Behind them, half hidden by the angle, rose a tall figure whose outline resembled Miles's own silhouette, though the proportions were subtly wrong. Arms too long, shoulders slightly concave inward. His throat tightened. The film felt warm despite the freezer air. A drop of condensed water slid off its edge, struck the grate, and hissed like fat in a skillet. The footprints along both wings brightened, as though absorbing the drop's heat, then darkened again. A distant metallic clang echoed from the laboratory wing, followed immediately by an answering chime from the dormitory direction, the two tones harmonizing into the same 5-note cadence the frozen forest had rung minutes before. The lights stuttered, and in that half-second strobe he glimpsed at the end of each corridor a pair of reflections, one set vivid green, the other dull crimson, hovering at human eye height but separated by 10 yards of blackness. The power steadied, and the reflections vanished, leaving only the competing trails of footprints and the smell of lilac turning slowly rancid. A decision pressed upon him. Choose one path or stand in the cross forever. Outside, a sudden gust battered the station shell with crystalline grit, and somewhere beneath the floor a deep chord vibrated, tuning itself to his racing pulse. Miles clenched the film strip until its edges cut his gloves. Then, heart thrumming against a cage that felt thinner than flesh, he stepped toward the darker wing, following the spiral unspooled into unknown depths. Miles edged into the laboratory wing, the handheld lamp painting ragged ellipses across racks of dormant equipment. The narrow passage funneled cold air that smelled of freon and wet plaster, as though the guts of the station had been torn open and left to fester. His boots slapped metal grating out of sync with the after echo, creating a double rhythm that quickened his breaths. Halfway along, the ceiling dipped without warning. Insulation bulged downward like a pale membrane, quivering with each pulse of the unseen heartbeat saturating the structure. Ben's name surfaced in Miles' memory with the sting of a fresh bruise. He pictured the two of them years ago, calibrating Doppler balloons in a storm, Miles shouting for Ben to hold the tether longer, Ben slipping on the slick deck. The guilt sharpened now because the corridor's faint tremor matched the cadence of Ben's labored breaths that night. He shook the thought away, but the vibration intensified, spreading through floor and walls until it resonated in his molars. The wet footprints guided him past a row of sealed cryo-freezers. Frosted doors bore gray smears that resembled handprints dragged downward, nails carving thin crescents through the rime. One unit hummed despite the dead grid, the lone green diode blinking in time with the floor's throb. Every blink flushed the corridor with a sickly hue, revealing that the icy handprints were not random. They formed staggered lines, converging toward a maintenance hatch at knee height. The hatch's screws rusted into florid spirals mirroring the pattern outside, as though the metal had flowed like syrup before solidifying. A skittering noise erupted behind the panels, faint but definite, like claws on foil. It traveled the length of the freezer bay, halted at the maintenance hatch, and then scratched softly, as if whatever crawled inside tested the barrier for weakness. Miles's stomach folded. Sweat chilled against his ribs. He moved on, refusing to glance back. The passage kinked left where it should have run straight, depositing him in the antechamber for the atmospheric scanner. Here, the footprints vanished, yet the floor glistened, coated in a varnish of ice so thin it reflected his shape inverted beneath him. On that mirrored surface, his reflection lagged a heartbeat behind, lifting a foot a fraction late, turning its head after his, always just out of sync. Each misaligned gesture produced a soft rasp, a slip sandpaper whisper that came not to his ears but directly to the nerves in his teeth. He realized with abrupt nausea that the whisper was timed to his pulse, the sound rising in volume every time his heart pumped harder. He forced his gaze upward and saw that the room's far wall had disappeared. In its place yawned an aperture onto darkness granular with drifting crystals, as though he stared into a snowstorm trapped inside a vacuum jar. Out of that swirl emerged a single strip of film, fluttering weightless until it slapped flat against the ceiling above him. The negative pulsed with internal light, revealing sequential frames. Ben lying on icy concrete, Ben's mouth moving silently, Ben's breath fogging the lens. In the final frame, Ben stared directly up into the camera, irises glazed with auroral green. Something beyond the picture cast a long, hooked shadow across Ben's torso, an arm jointed wrongly, ending in fingers too many and too thin. A surge of pressure cinched the room. The inverted reflection under Miles rippled, split, and seeped upward through the ice like ink drawn by capillary action, staining the air with a lattice of black veins. Each vein propagated a tremor through the walls, spawning a low hiss that escalated into a choir of overlapping whispers. Not a single word formed, yet the consonants of his name hid everywhere, nested in the susurrus like burrs in wool. The utter wrongness of the sound drove him backward toward the kinked corridor, but the floor tilted forward, pitching him instead through the scanner doorway. He plunged into a chamber choked with cables hanging like petrified vines. At its center, a spherical sensor pod rotated despite dead power, gyros ticking rhythmically. Each tick coincided with a sudden itch beneath his skin, as though microfilaments burrowed along his veins, following the drumbeat of the station. He pressed gloved fingers to his forearm. Flesh twitched under the fabric, not with muscle but with something serpentine sliding against bone. Panic flared, raw and chemical. He lunged for the exit, but the hanging cables swung together, knitting into a temporary cage that forced him to duck and weave. As he squeezed through, one cable brushed his cheek. An image detonated behind his eyes. Ben's corpse rising, eyelids snapping open, mouth stretching wide to emit a ringing glass note. The vision vanished the instant contact broke, yet the echo remained, pealing from deep within the corridor ahead. Miles burst free, stumbled, and braced against a bulkhead that pulsed warm as living tissue. The whisper receded, leaving a residual scrape beneath his skin as if microscopic claws hunted for purchase. He pushed on, jaw clenched so hard his ears rang, unaware that every imprint of his boots now filled with a faint green glow, marking his passage like breadcrumbs for whatever waited to follow. Miles staggered into the observation gallery, a narrow spine of reinforced glass modules jutting from the station's north flank like vertebrae exposed to the sky. Outside, daylight had thinned to the color of drowned bone. Snow clouds pressed low enough to brush the ridge, yet no flakes fell. Instead, frozen dust hung motionless, suspended as if gravity were an optional setting. The gallery floor vibrated with the same subterranean pulse that had haunted every corridor, only stronger here, as though the hill beneath the pylons carried a second heart. A row of digital clocks lined the ceiling, each slaved to the same GPS time signal. They should have marched in perfect unison, but their seconds desynchronized, diverging like fretful metronomes. One read 2:07 p.m., a second 2:09, a third flickered between numerals that did not exist. Miles's gaze snagged on an analog wall clock that none of the manuals mentioned. Its red second hand swept smoothly until it struck the 12, then shuddered backward, ticking in reverse. The cheap plastic lens warped his reflection into a blank-eyed caricature before the hand resumed forward motion. Beneath the clock, an old Polaroid had been taped to the wall. The image showed the same gallery under summer light, but the glass bays numbered only 2. He remembered there had always been 2. Yet ahead of him stood 3, a left window whose glass bowed outward like a soap bubble frozen mid-burst, a matching right pane, and between them an arc of tempered glass smeared with interior frost. Ice crystals filmed the third pane in delicate dendrites, each branch curving into microscopic spirals. A prickling certainty told him this was the third window Ben's note had warned about. From somewhere behind, the cables he had fled minutes earlier clattered against a bulkhead, the rattle synchronizing with the clock's failing tempo. Miles's breath misted, then folded back on itself, dividing into twin curls that slid toward the middle pane and vanished against the frost. He stepped closer in spite of everything he knew, boots whispering across resin that flexed a fraction late, sending gentle ripples ahead of his weight. The ripple reached the base of the pane and rebounded, returning as a chill that lapped up his shins. Within the frost, shadows moved. They did not belong to clouds or treetops. They pivoted too quickly, angles too sharp. One shadow craned upward until its apex matched where his head would be on the opposite side, then flattened into nothing. A second bloomed from the bottom edge, thin as a reed, lengthening until it met the first, and sketched a crude outline of a man whose arms were slightly too long, torso slightly concave. The form held for 3 beats of the subterranean heart before dissolving. Miles's watch buzzed a low battery warning, but the display showed a full charge. The hour field melted into a scrolling text that read 2:10, 2:11, 2:11, 2:11. The numeral loop pulsed in harmony with the gallery floor. That unseen heartbeat now drummed directly beneath his sternum, rattling his ribs like cage bars. He tried to retreat, yet the gallery seemed to lengthen behind him, the doorway sliding farther down an impossible corridor. Panic swelled, then collapsed into a sharper emotion. Anticipation, almost hunger. He realized the station was not just luring him, it was teaching him to follow. Every spiral, every mirrored cadence, every film strip had been a lesson in attention, and the final test waited inside the frost. He pressed his gloved palm against the middle window. The cold bit through fabric instantly, numbing skin, yet a second temperature seeped outward. A fever heat that smelled of electrical arcing and crushed lilac. Frost recoiled from his touch, clearing a circle the size of a dinner plate. Beyond the glass opened a depthless black. Not the ridge, not the sky, but a void packed with glittering particles spinning in slow centrifuge. At the void's center floated a familiar figure. Ben, but drained of color, eyes wide, pupils dilated into candle flame points of auroral green. His lips moved in a silent scream Miles could not hear, though every nerve felt the vibration. Then Ben's head tilted, mouth spreading wider, impossible wider, until teeth fused into a single ring of glass that rang a pure, ascending note. Behind Miles, the row of clocks snapped into synchronization on 2:11 precisely. All the second hands froze. The ringing in the glass leapt to the gallery structure, pinging down metal struts, through resin flooring, into his bones. Ben's image shattered into a storm of facets that swirled away like shoals of ice fish, and in their retreat a darker silhouette coalesced. Limbs jointed backwards, shoulders narrowing into a hooded point, face a mirrored void that reflected Miles's stunned gape. He tore his hand free. The cleared patch of window iced over instantly, trapping the silhouette mid-formation. The gallery lights died, plunging him into twilight, striped only by the ghost glow of the frozen pane. The pulse beneath the floor surged once, twice, and the third beat snapped the resin tiles, sending spiderweb cracks racing toward his boots. Instinct found an exit where sight could not. He sprinted, the corridor seeming to shrink now, funneling him toward the hatch even as fractures chased his heels. At the threshold he risked a glance back. The frost on the middle window writhed, rising from the glass like smoke, forming cursive letters that spelled a single, inescapable name, Miles, before melting into dripping rivulets. The clocks flickered, resumed, and their seconds began to count forward again, yet every click sounded off by half a beat, as though time itself now limped in his wake. Miles burst through the service airlock and into a twilight that looked poured from molten pewter. The ridge's open yard, which hours earlier had been a simple swath of churned snow, now shimmered like a frozen lake shattered and glued back together. Each panelet reflected a warped slice of the storm-dimmed sky, so the ground appeared tessellated with gray, unblinking eyes. Where his boots struck, the crust fractured, sending concentric rings of hairline cracks racing outward with a crystalline chatter. The sound echoed off the research modules behind him, and the walls answered in a metallic harmony, as though the building itself applauded his flight. The afternoon sun hid somewhere above the overcast, but a green-blue pall radiated from the fractures at his feet, throwing slanted bars of light across the yard. Those bars crawled after him, adjusting angle whenever he changed direction, guiding him downslope toward the tree line. He felt herded, an animal driven through chutes invisible to every sense except dread. Halfway to the pickup, he realized the Ford no longer occupied its berm of drifted snow. In its place rested a transparent silhouette, the exact shape and size of the truck, rendered in ice so flawlessly polished that it mirrored the underlit clouds in perfect inversion. Beneath the hood lay a matrix of delicate glass cogs already ticking, each click synchronized with a pulsing throb in Miles' temples. As he stared, the cab door on the ice replica hinged open, revealing nothing but a black cavity dense with swirling frost. A thunderous crack split the plateau. The research station behind him telescoped upward, modules stacking like children's blocks forced to occupy the same space. Windows popped in sprays of diamond splinters, those shards hovering momentarily before aligning into a new spiral that widened over the yard like a blooming frost flower. The first flake of glass snow drifted down, then another, until the air clogged with glitter that rang against his parka in soft, continuous chimes. Every flake that touched the ground fused into the tessellated crust, thickening it, raising its reflective sheen, and shrinking the islands of safe footing. He sprinted, feeling micro-fissures propagate beneath each heel, relayed behind him in a widening fan that pursued like predator jaws. The sharp edges knifed through the boot soles. Cold pricked his arches where rubber gave way. Pain sharpened his focus but dulled his balance. He nearly toppled when the ice ford flickered, glitched like a corrupted video frame, and reappeared 20 yards farther down slope, as if repositioned by an unseen cursor. Its door still gaped, and within that void the swirling frost now formed Ben's outline, colorless and still, a photographic negative waiting for developer. Refusal became survival. Miles veered left, straight into the timber, but the forest had transformed into a cathedral of glass. Every lodgepole pine wore a sheath of translucent armor, needles fused into crystalline quills that chimed when touched by wind too weak to move loose snow. Branches sagged, brittle under the accumulation, and as he passed they snapped, detonating in tinkling cascades that carpeted the ground with daggers. He darted between trunks, boots slipping, lungs rasping blood-warm vapor that condensed instantly into shards around his lips. A clearing opened ahead, a shallow declivity whose bowl gathered the drifting shards into spiraling dunes. At the hollow's center rose a pillar. Frozen lake water extruded through a fissure, sculpted by wind into a twisting spire. Embedded a foot below its summit glowed the weather balloon data core he had come to retrieve, its LED pulsing a steady amber. The pulse matched the tempo that had haunted the station and the ice truck gears, knitting every horror into a single metronome. He understood then that the ridge no longer hosted an anomaly. The ridge had become an instrument, and the data core was its tuning fork. The realization came with an auditory hallucination, or so he prayed, a rising chorus of soft footfalls circling the tree line. No shapes emerged, but for every footfall a flake of glass jounced higher than physics allowed, suspended midair, then settled again. The chorus tightened, herding him toward the spire. He waded into the bowl, shins slicing through serrated dunes, each step freeing a breathy whistle as compressed air escaped the layered shards. At the spire's base he reached for the core. The ice was slick yet warm, as if liquid glass flowed just beneath the rind. When his fingertips brushed the cylinder, the amber pulse flared white, blinding, and the vibration inside the pillar surged until the whole structure trembled like a tuning rod struck by a hammer. Fissures webbed outward from the spire into the dunes, through the forest, up the slope, racing toward the research station now towering 6 stories high. The silence before rupture stretched thin as wire. Then the spire exploded, not into debris but into a cyclone of needles that reversed gravity, spiraling upward in a roaring column. At its core hung the data cylinder, spinning faster until it blurred into a ring of light. Miles flung himself backward. Shards skated over his parka, stitched shallow scores across exposed skin, and clattered away. The cyclone collapsed as suddenly as it formed, shards dropping like spent casings. The cylinder clinked to earth beside him, inert, its LED dead. The plateau around him had changed again. The forest receded, trunks thinning into silhouettes, the station shrinking to a child's toy shape in the distance. All perspective felt malleable, distances folding and unfolding like map paper in restless hands. Miles clutched the core and staggered uphill, drawn by the impossible geometry of the ridge rearranging to funnel him somewhere he could not yet see, somewhere that felt eerily like a narrowing throat of glass waiting for the next shattering breath. Miles crested the rim of the bowl and found himself inside a soundless corridor of sky. Clouds had stratified into motionless ribs, each band a slightly different shade of greenish-gray, as though the atmosphere were a fossilized spine arching over the Bitterroot Range. Snow no longer fell. Instead, motes of powdered glass hovered in perfectly still columns that made the air look scored by invisible wire. When he stepped through one of those columns, the motes rearranged, spelling the number 211 in fleeting negative space before dispersing again. The research station, once a distant toy, now loomed a dozen yards away despite his climb covering barely half the slope. Its walls had shed color, taking on the mirrored translucence of the frozen pines, so its bulk reflected the warped horizon with unsettling clarity. Every panel throbbed in time with the data core clutched to his chest, and faint under that pulse came a whispering susurrus that mimicked his heartbeat just out of phase, a sonic afterimage that forced his pulse to stumble. He entered through the cargo ramp, which lay open like a jaw unhinged. Inside, the familiar corridors had collapsed into a labyrinth of overlapping planes. Floors kinked upward into walls. Ceiling panels spiraled downward like pages of a torn notebook. The geometry evolved each time he blinked, but always it shaped a path toward the gallery where the third window waited. The air smelled of lilac gone to rot and hot circuitry, and every footfall released a micro clink, as though he walked on spilled beads of glass. At the gallery threshold, the analog clock he remembered now hung alone. Its plastic lens melted smooth. The face displayed no numbers, only a luminous 211 that stretched and contracted like a lung. The second hand ticked neither forward nor backward, but oscillated over a 2-second arc, generating a click-click rhythm that matched the tremor of the floorboards. With each oscillation, a hiccup of static spurted from the intercom, forming truncated syllables that almost built his name. He stepped inside and faced the third window. Frost had withdrawn to the edges, revealing a pane that no longer looked onto the ridge. Instead, the glass opened onto a corridor identical to the one behind him, yet rotated 90 degrees, violating gravity with casual disdain. In that impossible passage walked a lone figure, head bowed, clutching something cylindrical that pulsed amber. Each time the figure's boots struck, Miles felt the vibration under his own feet a half-second later. Realization tightened his scalp. The figure was himself, half a heartbeat out of phase, trapped in a loop that fed back through the pain. He raised the data core. The cylinder flickered, revived, and began to glow in 3 pulse bursts, 2 beats faint, 1 bright, echoing the gallery's ticking clock. Across the glass, his doppelganger mirrored the movement, but at a lag, bright pulse answering bright pulse, until both strobed in perfect call and response, an optical Morse code repeating 211 in base 3 cadence. The clocks behind him multiplied without sound, materializing along the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. Every face displayed 211, but the fonts varied. Digital, Roman, handwritten, 7-segment, like artifacts scavenged from 1,000 timelines. Their second hands twitched in asynchronous tremolos, creating a rattling rainstick sound that made his vision vibrate. The pain shivered in sympathy, surface rippling like pond water struck by a stone. Through those ripples, the reflection of his other self warped, joints elongating, torso hollowing, until the shape matched the hooded silhouette that had haunted the ridge. A pressure front raced through the gallery, slamming doors and extinguishing lights. Total darkness lasted a single heartbeat, then a flare of auroral green erupted from every crack in the structure. The glow revealed that the pain was gone. Where it had been yawned a doorway into the rotated corridor. Air whipped between realities, dragging glittering snow from both directions into a swirling helix that spiraled down the throat of the opening. Miles's bones pulsed with the station's tempo, two soft, one hard, driving him forward. Yet, as his boot crossed the threshold, a shard of intuition struck. The rhythm was not luring him in, but pushing something out. He looked down. The snow cyclone deposited a granular silhouette at his feet, assembling from heel to crown, sculpting a glass figure whose hollow eyes already burned with auroral fire. Its chest cavity echoed with the 3-pulse beat, louder than his own heart. He staggered back, lifting the data core like a talisman. The cylinder's LED blazed white, and a harmonic tone burst forth, a chord composed of every clock's tick fused into singular resonance. The glass figure convulsed, fractures raced across its surface, releasing a keening whine that sounded exactly like Ben's last breath. Miles hurled the cylinder into the doorway. The moment it crossed, the pane resealed in a flash freeze bloom, trapping the device and the convulsing doppel inside the frozen wall like insects in amber. Silence detonated, so heavy it felt liquid. One by one, the myriad clocks disintegrated into snow-fine dust that sifted to the floor without a sound. The residual glow faded. In the dying light, he saw that the analog clock's second hand had ceased its spasm, now pointing steadfast at the 12. No numerals defined the face, but he felt in his marrow that the gallery finally trusted a different hour. He turned toward the exit. The corridor beyond lay still, geometry restored to dull Euclidean sanity. Yet, from deep in the station, somewhere impossible to map, came a faint echo. Click, click, click. Two soft, one hard, repeating at the edge of hearing. Outside, a breeze stirred the frozen forest and returned the same cadence, tapping against the window like fingernails on crystal. Miles understood with resigned clarity that the ridge had not been silenced, merely tuned. Whatever song it would play next, he would hear it, whether a minute or a lifetime later, whenever the hands of unseen clocks aligned once more on 2:11.